I am convinced that when historians of the future, should there be historians in the future or a future, I am convinced, which I'm sure there will be, I am convinced that when historians look back on our present era, they will see it as marked by several signal moral failures. Among them will be the moral failure that is represented by mass incarceration in this country, the notion that we would, in effect, imprison and warehouse millions of human beings with such a biased approach to it, with just both those facts, the bias and the scale of the incarceration, will be recognized for the human disgraces they are in the future. That's my personal belief. Our next guest, who's returning to the program, she's been on before, is very active in the fight to end incarceration. Jessica Jackson Sloan is a human rights attorney. She began her career representing California death row inmates, appealing their sentences. She now oversees Dream Corps' Cut 50, that's hashtag CUT50, Cut 50 initiative to end mass incorporation. She's on the Committee for a Fair Judiciary. She serves as advisory board member of the American Constitution Society Bay Area chapter. In November of 2013, Jessica became the youngest ever elected official in Marin County when she was elected to the Mill Valley City Council. And in November of 2016, she became the mayor of Mill Valley, California, which is a beautiful place if you haven't visited it. So first of all, Jessica, welcome back to the program.
Thank you for having me back on.
Secondly, I'm going to assume, by dint of your work with Cut 50, that you agree with me about the moral tragedy that is mass incarceration.
I'll agree with you, not just by way of my work as an attorney, but also by way of my personal experience. When I was 22 years old, my first husband was incarcerated. I just had a baby 2 months before, and he was sentenced to 15, served 6, ended up serving 3.5 years because of his drug addiction, and it ripped our family apart. So I know firsthand the moral tragedy of mass incarceration and the impact that it has on families across this country.
And, you know, the more we look at mass incarceration, the more dimensions to that tragedy that you would know very well, both personally and professionally, but that many people don't recognize, including the fact that people, you know, if we think about rehabilitation, that rehabilitation is based on the nurturing power of being close to those you love, close to the people you have familial and social relationships with, on being able to speak with them regularly by phone, perhaps see them with a computer connection. All of those things are made vastly more difficult by a mass incarceration system that often puts people far away from those they love, that often charges usurious rates for a video call or a phone call, on and on and on. I mean, the many ways, great and small, that this dehumanizes people and harms them and those around them and the communities in which they live. We could go on forever about that, I have a feeling, or at least for a very long time. But I think that what the topic of the day today is the prison reform bill that's currently being crafted. Is that correct?
Yes, the First Step Act. It was introduced on Monday, and we went to Judiciary House Committee for markup yesterday, and were able to make it out of that committee with 25 votes, 5 noes, 25 yeses. And it was a mixed bag of Democrats and Republicans. We had 10 Democrats in favor, 2 more who voiced their support but got pulled away. So, you know, it's actually a bipartisan bill passing through Washington that would get 4,000 people out of prison back home to their families and address a lot of the factors you were just talking about in terms of, you know, the distance people are having to drive, the amount of time they get on the phone with their loved ones, the amount of visitation that they're getting. And of course, you know, most importantly, it addresses the fact that right now our prisons are not a place of rehabilitation. They're a warehouse, and they're often a warehouse where people go and get further traumatized. And we need to be making them into centers for rehabilitation that help give people the resources they need and the tools they need to get back on their feet and to come home job ready.
You know, I think one of the aspects, and I want to get into the details of the bill in a minute, but I think there are a couple of things I want to address on a broader scale, if that's okay with you, Jessica.
Yeah.
Number one is the fact that there are a lot of people out there, including, I imagine, people even who are listening to this show, who think, well, you know, they did bad stuff, and so bad things happen to them. Hey, if you don't want that to happen, don't do bad stuff. But I think what people miss, aside from the whole notion of compassion, which is supposed to be one of our core values, I think what people miss with that approach is the near ubiquity of drug addiction or mental illness. My sense is, I haven't looked at the figures recently, but when you look at the statistics for people who are incarcerated, there is a very high percentage of people who have either some form of mental illness or drug addiction, or in many cases both. Is that correct?
Absolutely correct. There's one other that you didn't add in there that I think is what's a primary driver in at least the women's population. And you have to think the women's population has increased rapidly over the last 2 decades. We've seen a 700% increase in the women's population in prison. So one of the major factors there is literally a sexual abuse to prison pipeline that is being built across this country. When you talk to women who are inside, 86% of them say that they were sexually traumatized, raped prior to coming to prison. So again, we need to address mental illness, we need to address addiction, but we also need to address trauma that's happening out in people's homes and communities that's impacting them in a negative way and driving mass incarceration.
Well, it's a very important addition, and I thank you for that. The second general issue, before we get into the specifics of the bill, that I wanted to mention to you is what we might call the strange bedfellows factor. The fact that, this is a bipartisan bill. Yeah. The fact that you have people like, I believe, Charles Koch has come on board with this, who's not a favorite of many progressives. That you have people really from across the political spectrum saying that mass incarceration is a problem that needs to be stopped. Now, I'm not a Pollyanna about, let's all come together and sing Kumbaya. And with my economic hat on, I'm not always thrilled with what bipartisanship has wrought in the past. But in this case, there really does, obviously it's got its opponents and its reactionaries who are against prison reform, but there really is a kind of transpartisan dimension to all this, isn't there?
Look, I'm left as far as you can get, and Van Jones is further left than that. So we've been working with a bipartisan coalition for the last 4 years, including Newt Gingrich, the Koch Industries, Cory Booker over on the left working with us as well, ACLU working with Koch, lots of organizations coming together around the issue of bipartisan criminal justice reform. And most recently, I would add Jared Kushner to that list. He cares about this issue. He's coming from a deep personal place as well. His father was incarcerated while he was in law school, and it had a huge impact on him, and I think is what's driving his involvement in this issue. But it's not just economic reasons that bring the right on. And I want to be clear about that. We have heard, from folks, it's a moral issue for them as well. But I think for everybody, left and right, it's also a public safety issue. So you talked earlier about there's some people out there who say, forget the bad people. We should just be locking them up, and who cares to them what happens in there. I was probably in that camp before my husband went to prison. And once I got to see, who was in there and what was going on. And more importantly, once I learned that 96% of the 2.2 million people who are in prison are coming home one day, right? So it's a public safety issue, because you have to think, do you want somebody who's been warehoused and traumatized further and not given any support during their incarceration to come home and live next door to you? Or do you want somebody who's been through the rehabilitative process, who's taken accountability for their actions, who's transformed themselves, rehabilitated themselves, been given the opportunity to get the skills that they need to succeed, come home job ready, ready to hit the ground and succeed living next door to you, right? So I think the bill, the First Step Act, really goes to addressing that gap in what our prisons are right now versus what they should be. And that's why there's so much bipartisan support for it.
That makes a lot of sense. And again, we're talking with Jessica Jackson Sloan, who, in addition to being the mayor of Mill Valley, California, is overseeing Cut 50, that's hashtag CUT50 for Dream Corps. So, Jessica, tell us a little bit about the First Step Act. Where is it now? You mentioned that it addresses some of the issues that we were talking about at the beginning of this segment. You think it's a pretty good bill now, and what is its likelihood of passage?
Yeah. Well, let me say, when we came onto this, we were not in support of the bill. We were not opposed to the bill, but we were neutral. And had we had to be taking a position at that time, we probably would have opposed, because to me, it wasn't where it needed to be for it to be a meaningful reform. I have watched Congressmen Jeffries and Collins working together over the last few months to really make this bill something meaningful that addresses a lot of the issues we've been talking about here. And I'll say, I think, Hakeem Jeffries has been sort of an unsung hero in this. We know how tense the political landscape is right now, but he's been willing to come across the aisle, reach across the aisle, work with Congressman Collins and other Republicans, and really, continue to believe in the process and negotiate and come to the table every day, because he knows there are too many people sitting in prison right now for us to put politics first, right? We have to put people over politics. So I think the bill is now in a really strong place, thanks to Congressman Jeffries and Collins' work on it. It addresses all the issues we were talking about with families and visitation and facilitating that. But it also fixes the good time credit system, which is why it would release in 4,000 people coming home. It creates an incentive structure in the prison, because we want to make sure there is robust programming for people to rehabilitate themselves within the prison. We also need to make sure that we're giving them incentives to do so. So it creates an incentive system in the prison, so people are incentivized to do the programming. It authorizes $50 million a year to go into the prisons and into programming to help make sure that we have the programming available. It also allows volunteers to come in the prison. And I'll tell you, I like this for a couple of reasons. One, we need more people in prisons running programming, so it scratches that itch. But two, because, the more people are in the prisons, and I'll tell you, one of the prisons in our country with the lowest recidivism rate is San Quentin State Prison right here in my backyard, and I volunteer there. They have 13,000 volunteers a year coming in. And they've got one of the lowest recidivism rates, because not only can they offer more programming, but also because there are people in there who are coming in who can serve as mentors, who can give the folks inside some hope, who can just begin to build relationships and networks with people on the outside. So when they come out, they actually have a support system. And they're also, eyes and ears that are inside of the prison. Too often our prisons lack any sort of transparency. So the more folks we can have on the outside going in, the more we can be aware of problems that are coming up and increase our programming. So the bill does a lot of great things. It's headed to the House floor now, which we're very excited about. And my belief is it's only going to improve and hopefully pass.
Well, that's a good report. Now, this bill sends 4,000 prisoners home. I'm going off recollection now, we have 2.2 million Americans in prison. What would the next, it's called the First Step Act. What's the next step? Assuming it passes. We should be clear on a couple of things. So these folks who will be coming home, the goal is to have people coming home who are job ready to reintegrate. So these are folks who have been completing programming, who've been showing good conduct while they're in prison, not folks who have been getting write-ups and whatnot. They're, I guess what you would call, model people in prison. And I hate to use the word prisoner or inmate or anything like that. I just refer to them as people, because, that's what they are.
But those 4,000 are coming out of the federal system. And right now there's 186,000 people in the federal system. So this bill only addresses the federal system. The states are passing reforms and moving along. I'm excited. We've actually been working on bills all across the country to help women inside of prisons. There's been a lot of movement on criminal justice reform in the states, including in red states like Oklahoma, Tennessee, Louisiana, Texas. Believe it or not, Texas has closed prisons. I think last year alone, they got rid of almost 2,000 prison beds. And as a result, crime's not going up. In fact, crime is actually going down because they've enacted some very smart reforms. So this will begin to address some of the federal issues. We still need sentencing reform. That's not in this bill. That's the next step. But this is a very important first step, and it will send a strong signal that the bipartisan groups are willing to come to the table and work to bring people home.
Well, that's a good report overall. Obviously, there is much to do. And where can people go to find out more about the issue and specifically Cut 50's work on this issue?
You can visit cut50.org. You can find all of our campaigns on there and information about how you can get involved. We've got what we call the Empathy Network. So it's a network across the country of organizations, hundreds of organizations in 40 different states. We'll be holding events. But I would ask that people visit our website and sign up, because we're going to be sending out information as this bill is moving, as well as requests for help getting it passed. It's going to take everybody leaning in and getting involved and making sure that this thing gets passed.
All right, well, great. Well, thank you so much for coming back on the program. We've been talking with Jessica Jackson Sloan, human rights attorney, co-founder of Cut 50 and mayor of one of my favorite towns in America, Mill Valley, California. So Jessica, as always, thanks for the great work and great talking to you.
Thank you, RJ.